Mike Andrews is an associate professor of economics at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Prior to joining UMBC in 2020, he was a postdoctoral fellow in innovation policy at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Excited to be here.
So, to start, I'd love to just kind of dive into talking about innovation and entrepreneurship. Can you talk about how we as a society or as organizations or communities effectively encourage and foster innovation and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I mean that's really the $1 million question, right? So I think maybe before I start, maybe let me take a couple minutes and just talk about why I think that's exactly the right question we should be asking, right? Because like you wouldn't ask that question about a lot of kinds of goods out there in the economy. You wouldn't start an interview by saying, like, what are we doing to make sure that we're encouraging the production of pizzas or ice cream? And I like pizza and ice cream. I think those are great things, but somehow we think innovation is different, where we need to make sure that society is taking particular steps to get the right amount of that. So why is that the case, right? I think there's several reasons. So there's at least three things that come to mind. One is that innovation is just highly uncertain, right? When we talk about innovation, we're talking about new ideas, and I don't know what a new idea is going to look like until I have it, until it pops into my head, right? So when we're thinking about innovation, we've got to put in a lot of upfront costs, a lot of experimentation early on when the outcome is highly uncertain, when I don't know whether it's going to work or not, right? That's different from pizza. When I make a pizza, I basically know what it's going to look like when it comes out of the oven when I start. Um, the second thing that's different is ideas are what we call in economics non-rivalrous. So if I, let's say, come up with a new idea and I put that out there into the world, I post it on the internet, I broadcast it, I shout it from the rooftops. Everybody can hear that idea and use it at the same time, right? So everybody can use the theory of calculus at the same time without diminishing anyone else's ability to use it. Everyone can use the same pizza recipe at the same time without diminishing someone else's ability to use a pizza recipe. That's, again, this is different from pizza, because if I eat a slice of pizza, it's gone. You can't eat that same slice. And it turns out this is really important, because if ideas are non-rivalrous like this, if I put an idea out there into the world, it's very hard to claw it back. So other people can hear that idea and create it on their own, copy what I'm doing, and that might make it very difficult for me to actually earn an economic return from my idea. So we call that the appropriability problem. And it's a problem because if ideas are costly to create and highly uncertain, I've got to make these big uncertain upfront investments, and then I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make a return on the back end, I may not have the right incentives to create ideas in the first place. Okay. And another thing that's very interesting about innovation is that they're cumulative, right? So ideas build on each other. And they build on each other. And also, we think a lot of new ideas are recombinations of existing ideas. So um, here, even if I have a new innovation, if I know that you need to build on the foundation that I built, right? If you want to innovate, you need to build on what I've already done. But I don't think I can get compensated for that. Even if I come up with a new idea, I may not have the right incentives to actually disclose it and spread it around the world. So ideas might get sort of trapped in individual people's brains and not diffuse. So for all those reasons, we're worried that we might not be getting enough innovation, again, in ways that we're not worried that we're not getting enough pizza or ice cream. So what are we doing? Let's finally return to your question. What are we doing to actually try and make sure we're getting the right amount of innovation? I spent several minutes telling you how innovation is different from other goods, but in a lot of ways, innovation is just another good. So I'm an economist. When you ask me, are we getting the right quantity of something? I think about supply and I think about demand, right? So if we want to encourage innovation, we need robust demand, we need robust supply. I think this is slowly changing over the last few decades, but I think for most of the time when economists have thought about uh, doing academic research on the economics of innovation, and I think a lot of innovation policy too. When we've thought about promoting innovation, we've thought about the demand side. Okay, so basically, how can we as society try and make sure that you as an innovator, when you're getting compensated for creating your innovation, you're seeing basically how much we as society are willing to pay, right? The price that you're getting is reflecting our society's willingness to pay. So that's why we have things like intellectual property. So the idea here is I come up with a new idea. Um, we're afraid if I just tell everyone about it, other people will copy me. I won't be able to earn an economic return, so I might not make those investments in the first place. So what we do is we give you a legal right, something like a patent, right? That lets me exclude for a limited time, exclude other people from profiting from my innovation, right? So by giving people this legal right, we've now solved this appropriability problem because we're now allowing you to profit from your innovation for a limited time. So we're trying to encourage you to create the innovation in the first place by allowing you to profit from it. So that's sort of, and there's other demand side policies too. You could think about, prizes for innovations, even things like R&D subsidies or tax credits sort of take the same flavor. So that's really demand side policies. On the supply side, this is where I spend a lot of my time thinking. But the idea here is if we think ideas come from sort of recombining earlier ideas, what we need to do is figure out how to help people to have ideas quicker, make connections between ideas quicker, and sort of interact more frequently so that we can get more and more of these recombinations, right? So when we think about the supply side of innovation, things like education might play a role, right? Because we'd like people to come up with new ideas and to see connections faster. We could think about immigration policy because this affects, how many new ideas are we bringing into a country at a given time. We could think about communication and transportation technology because that's going to help ideas move around more quickly. A lot of my work's been looking at almost think of it as like urban policy. So like inside a particular location, how do we help ensure that people can communicate more easily with one another? So all these sorts of things help us to reduce the costs of creating a new idea. Okay. So sum up, we've got a suite of things that we think can help ensure there's robust demand for new ideas, a suite of things that we think can help to reduce the cost and create a robust supply of new ideas. If we have those two things, we should be doing a good job of encouraging innovation. Now, I would be lying to you if I told you that like we as an academic community knew exactly what the right mix of those things were, right? If we knew exactly what the right environment for encouraging innovation was, if we knew that, every place would be as innovative as Silicon Valley, and clearly that's not the case. So we sort of know big picture what we think the right things are. The devil is really in the details and getting the mix right, and that to me is what makes this such an exciting area to study and to do research on.
Yeah. Well, so could we take a step back just for a second? I was thinking as you were talking about um, when in the kind of process that you were describing, when is the innovation become the innovation? Like once you have an idea, is that innovation, or does it have to be translated into an improvement to a product or service? Or, how do you think about when an innovation has become an innovation? Does it have to be diffused into society, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I teach this, I take a very sort of big picture view. An innovation is anything that is new and potentially useful to somebody. Um, so, in that sense, I think to me, sort of an innovation begins at conception of the idea, right? Um, but I think in practice, like we don't want ideas to sort of wither and die in somebody's head. We want them to get out there into the world. So I sort of think of the process of diffusion as how innovations make it out there into society. I think both are important, right? We want to make sure we have the stock of ideas, right? We're getting new ideas popping into people's heads. And then we also want to make sure we've got the right incentives to, once you have an idea, they make it out there into the world where they can actually improve people's lives.
Yeah. How do you think about, you mentioned kind of the ideas interacting, ideas combining to create the innovation. How do you think about these perhaps incomplete ideas not being useful as when they are incomplete, but then doing what you described, where they're able to interact with other ideas or combine with other ideas, they become useful? How do you think about that process and just thinking again about the kind of the how we think about the return on investment or thinking about the time it takes to achieve innovation. How do you think about those ideas that aren't fully formed and what we know to do with them or don't know to do with them or how we should treat them?
Yeah, well, I think most ideas are not fully formed for a while, right? Like you take any famous innovation from history, and if you do a deep enough dive, you'll find it at some sort of embryonic stage where it really is not any good to anybody, and it takes often decades of development to get these things to the point where they're really useful to somebody. Um, so I think again, I think the risk is ideas sort of forming half formed in someone's brain and then never leaving there, right? So that's why I'm a fan of things like a patent system where in order to get a legal right you actually have to write your idea down so somebody can read it. It's a reason why I like academic publications, even if it seems like nobody's reading your work. They sort of live out there in perpetuity and somebody can stumble on them decades later and potentially learn from them. It's a reason I'm a big fan of informal social interactions, people just getting together and talking over beer and coffee, because I think that's when the half-formed ideas split out, spill out of your head, and sometimes your half-formed idea can interact with someone else's half-formed idea and form hopefully a whole idea, right? So I just think it's sort of a kitchen sink approach, but I think the more that we as society can do to spread these half-formed ideas and preserve them so that they can be recombined later, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. But you mentioned the academic community earlier. How do institutions of higher education affect local invention?
Yeah, great question. And a question policymakers care about a lot, right? So everybody wants to like create the next Silicon Valley. And there's this idea floating around, I think maybe for understandable reasons, that if you want to do that, a necessary, possibly even a sufficient condition is we need an institution of higher education. Um, I think when you think about what universities do, I think really of two things. I think we train students. So economists would say we're giving human capital. Um, and then the faculty are doing research, right? So we're trying to push forward the frontier of human knowledge. Um, what I think is interesting about those two things, it's not clear that the benefits from those two activities are mostly going to the local area that's actually housing the college and university, right? So like if we're interested in local effects, if I want to build the next Silicon Valley because I'd like, all the big tech companies to locate next to me, it's not clear that universities are doing a great job, right? So take, for instance, Mark Andreessen, who's at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, got a fantastic education in computer science, did some of the early work on how to create a web browser there, but then moved to Silicon Valley when he actually launched Netscape. So if you look at who's getting the state income tax revenue and the property tax revenue from Mark Andreessen, who's creating the jobs for people who work at Netscape, it's California. It's not Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. So thinking about local effects of colleges, I think is maybe related, but it's distinct from thinking about what are the effects of colleges, if that makes sense. So it turns out it's kind of difficult to think about what are the local effects of a college, because I think naively what you might want to do is just look at some place that has a college, right? Look at the rate of innovation in that area, compare it to someplace else that doesn't have a college, right? See how those rates of innovation are different. The problem is that colleges and universities, they're not built in random places. They go somewhere for a reason, right? So you're going to probably build a college somewhere that has, well, it's probably somewhere that's already fairly economically vibrant. It might be growing pretty quickly, so on a good growth trajectory. It might be close to some means of transportation or have some other sort of infrastructure that's going to be important for the college. And it's probably got a local population that has positive attitudes towards education and are open to new ideas and things like that. And all of those things are probably going to be positively correlated with how innovative an area is. So if we just compared rates of innovation in some place that has a college and some place that doesn't, what we might be picking up is the effect of all of these other factors and not the effect of the college itself, right? So you've probably heard the expression correlation does not imply causation. This is exactly the kinds of things we're worried about. Um, these are exactly the kinds of things that could bias our correlation if we just looked at places with colleges versus those without. If this were a medical study, the way we would solve this problem is we would run an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, right? We'd give some group a drug and we give some group a placebo. And as long as we're randomly deciding who gets which, we can compare the outcomes and determine what's the causal effect of the drug. Uh, it's really hard to do these kinds of randomized controlled trials with big public policies like establishing a university, right? It's very hard to get a legislature to agree to let you just randomly drop a college somewhere. And I think we're also interested not just in immediate effects, but long run effects, right? What effect do these institutions have, not just today, but over decades as they sort of shape a local area? So that's something else we can't study today, right? Because you need a long time to study long run effects. So the way I tried to do this, attack this in my research was trying to approximate these kinds of randomized controlled trials, but with historical data. So the idea here is like we know where colleges and universities are located today. If you go back and you look carefully at the historical record, you can find cases where the college was almost located here, but was located here instead for essentially random reasons. So now you effectively have a treatment group and a control group, and you can compare how these things evolve before and after the establishment of a college. Let me give you an example just to sort of illustrate the idea. Um, in the 1880s, the state of North Dakota was deciding where they wanted to build their state universities, University of North Dakota and North Dakota State. They couldn't decide. They couldn't decide. They couldn't decide, and they had actually a hard legislative deadline. It was something like they had to physically put a bill into the hopper by something like 5 p.m. And if they missed this deadline, they couldn't vote on this bill until the next legislative session. And at the time, the legislature wasn't meeting very often. I'm not even sure if they were meeting every year. It might have had to be 2 years. So it's quite a long delay. So they couldn't decide. There were like 4 or 5 towns in North Dakota that wanted to receive a university. They had to actually literally write the names of the towns on the bill to put it into the hopper. So to make sure they could decide in time, what they did was just wrote down the names on pieces of paper, put it into a hat, and then drew. So Fargo won. That's why North Dakota State is in Fargo. Grand Forks won. That's why the University of North Dakota is in Grand Forks. So we have this historical event where we essentially have random assignment of where the colleges are located. So what I did was look through a lot of old historical histories of narrative histories of the founding of colleges and universities, and found a whole bunch of these cases where we have essentially random assignment of a college location. And then we can compare what happens in the place that wins the college to these we call runner-up locations that almost received the college but didn't for an essentially random reason. What did I find? I found that colleges do in fact lead to more local innovation, also more population growth, similar magnitudes. So if you get a college, you have about 60% more patents per year than these runner-up locations. And I should also stress, like these runner-up locations, they're not just random places, right? These are places that we also thought would have been good candidates to get a college. So, if you compare it to middle of nowhere, that effect is probably much larger. What I think
So,
is, go
oh,
ahead,
sorry.
sorry.
Well, so just a quick question on that number. The 60%, you said 60% of more patents. Is that the number I heard
Yeah,
for?
it's about 60%.
So are those patents largely patents held by the institution, the higher education institution? And would that be the same? Would we expect the same impact if like a business were to be in a town? A business would hold more patents than this, a larger business would hold more patents than a series of, smaller businesses or individuals.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer to the first one is basically no. So one of the things I could do is go back and look at who are the people that are actually creating these patents. It's another thing that's fantastic about patent data is it actually gives us a record of who are these people that are coming up with new ideas. So what I could do is use a whole bunch of historical college yearbooks and figure out, is the name of this person on this patent, is he usually a he historically, but he or she, are they a faculty member of the university? You can also see, is the patent just assigned to the university? And basically the answer is no. Universities were doing very little patenting at the time. Today they do much more, particularly after like the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act. It's been an increasing trend for universities doing more patenting. Even taking that into account, the vast majority of patents in a college county are not coming from people at the college. I could also use these yearbooks to look at, are they coming from alumni? And by and large, they're not coming from alumni either,
Hmm.
right? So what's happening is you build a college, you get a lot more patents. They're not coming from anybody affiliated with the school. They're mostly coming from people who were born somewhere else and moved to locate next to the college. So I think what's largely happening is universities are acting as anchor institutions, in the sense of they're in many cases, especially in the West historically, they're literally putting a town on the map, right? And they're encouraging people and businesses to come and move to an area. And when people come and cluster together, we're getting those recombinations happening again. And they happen much more quickly when we're co-located, when we're in the same place. And that's what's driving the increase in innovation that we see. There's another sort of test I can do for in the paper. Um, when states rather are deciding where they want to put these universities, uh, sometimes, and actually North Dakota is a case of this, the states are going to decide where they want to put a lot of state institutions at the same time, right? So at the same time, when they're deciding where do I want to build the state university, I'm also deciding, well, where should I put the state capitol or the state prison or the state insane asylum? And like, I think prisons, insane asylums, not the same kinds of institutions that we think would have the same sort of role in promoting innovation hubs as universities. But if you compare the places that get the college to the place that gets the prison or the capitol or the insane asylum, they actually see nearly identical increases in patenting after the institution is built. So, you know, I don't think it's the inmates in the prison county that are getting the patents, but what's happening is historically prisons are operating fairly similar to colleges in that they're attracting people to come to a town. They're putting the place on the map. So most of what we're seeing is, again, colleges acting as anchors, getting people to come, and once people agglomerate, that's when we see more innovation.
Well, so a couple of questions there. So
Yeah.
you're saying it's because the institution is attracting more people. Is the innovation rate proportional to population in areas that, is it just that
It's a little higher. There's some evidence of what in economics we call increasing returns. So if you double the population, you get more than double the amount of patents. Um,
but I mean, is it like if there's a town that increases in population by 1,000 that doesn't have a higher education institution, and a town that increases by 1,000 that like one that does and one that doesn't have a higher education
yeah.
institution, is it just the 1,000 person increase that is causing the increase in patents, or is it uniquely the institution that there's something about the
No,
institution that
I
is
think
doing
it's
that?
mostly I think it's mostly just the fact that there's more people. So like again, the prison and the insane asylum, we also see similar increases. Yeah, so I think it's really a people story, not an institution story. Now,
Interesting.
I want to be clear about one thing. Like, I still think colleges are playing a role, right? Like, we're still educating students, and people with college degrees are still much more likely to go on and become innovators. But it's not all happening close to the college, right? The people are mostly, a lot of our most innovative alumni, they're the people that are most geographically mobile. So they're the ones that are going to go to Silicon Valley or Boston and do their patenting there. So I think there's sort of this question like, there's local effects of colleges, and then there's sort of this broader, more global role in promoting knowledge. Like if we want to promote the creation of knowledge, like universities are great, but it doesn't mean that the place that builds the college is specifically getting those benefits any more than we would get if, say, we located the capital of a large manufacturing firm that also acted as an anchor institution or something like that.
But the measurement that you're using for that is the number of patents. That's the thing that you're using as the signal that would say this is benefiting local community in this way, right? That
That's right. That's right. And partly, uh, there's partly it's because patent data is the data that we have, right? I've talked a couple times about all these great features of patents. We get to see what ideas people invent. We get to see the names of the innovators. We also just have lots of them over a very long period of time, covering many different types of technologies over the entire United States. So it lets us do these kinds of long-term comparisons in ways that we couldn't maybe do otherwise.
yeah.
But
Well, I'm
I
also
also want to say, actually, if I could, if we're specifically interested in innovation, it's not clear that colleges are any better than any other anchor institution. I've done some follow-up work, mostly with Lauren Russell at the Fels Institute of Government at University of Pennsylvania, where we do look at other outcomes. So colleges are much better than other institutions at increasing local educational attainment, for instance. They seem to have some effects on like civic participation that are different from other types of institutions. So again, I'm not saying that colleges have no effect. Specifically, if we want to think about what's their role as innovation hubs, it seems that the primary driver of increasing the rate of local innovation is just how many people can we get into a locality.
hmm. Well, so thinking about the Mark Andreessen example, is there any data available, or have there been any studies on um, the startups that have come out of universities, or the people that have come out of universities to work on startups that have then gone to Silicon Valley or wherever and have simply like, is there in the same way that you look at a yearbook to see if that person has put out a patent, could you also uh, look at the startup the amount of startups coming out of a university and attribute it at least to a country level data and say, because of our higher education um, ecosystem, our country has put out more startups than another country with less higher education institution?
Yeah, there's been a little bit of work on this. So I mean, the simplest thing you can do is look at like cross-country comparisons and look at, do places with more a higher share of the population that's educated, are they producing more innovations? Are they creating more startups? Things like that. And the answer tends to be yes. You worry like anytime you don't have something that sort of approximates an RCT, maybe the people that are getting education, maybe they would have also been creating innovations or launching startups anyway. So like that question's kind of hard to answer, but at least like descriptively, it sure looks like when people are more educated, they're doing more innovation and making more startups. Um, if you wanted to think like, drill down and think about like a particular university, it just becomes a tricky data challenge, right? It's kind of hard to link people back in time at scale and figure out, where they went to college. There's tools you can do this. You could scrape LinkedIn or something, and we're actually um, there are some other data sources you could potentially use. I think this is actually kind of one of the frontiers of this branch of research is pushing this forward and like actually trying to track alumni after they get out of the college. So I don't think we have maybe great answers on that today, but I think we will. Hopefully sometime in the not too distant future.
Very cool. Well, so I want to bring us back to like thinking about how we support innovation. And I wanted to ask you, does government investment in innovation and entrepreneurship need to have a clear ROI? And thinking about what you said at the beginning about the uncertainty, how should we think about government investment in innovation and entrepreneurship?
Yeah. Another great question. I think we want to be good stewards of our tax dollars. So I think it should have a positive ROI. The question is like, how do you measure ROI in the right way, right? You don't, because innovation, like you said, is uncertain and it's risky. If every single project that you fund has a positive ROI, you're probably not funding enough risky projects, right? So you really want to look at this as a portfolio, but it's even trickier in the case of public funding for innovation and entrepreneurship, particularly innovation and science, uh, because so many of the people who are actually sort of taking you know, go back to the beginning, right? We were talking about when does an idea become an innovation, right? And like eventually we'd like this thing to make it out into the world and actually improve people's lives. A lot of the people who are sort of taking the baton and getting it over the finish line are not going to be the people receiving the funding, right, the public funding to actually develop the idea in the first place. So we'd like to sort of be able to trace where did the idea come from when we're actually calculating the ROI. The third thing that makes it tricky is not only are there different people that are, say, commercializing the idea and actually earning an economic return and different from the ones that receive the funding, it also takes a long time, right? So we want to be able to calculate returns on investments that happened maybe 3 to 5 decades ago. So with all those caveats in place, my sort of read of the literature is public investment in basic science and early stage innovation tends to have an extremely high ROI. It's basically uniformly found throughout the literature.
Well, so thinking about or just the fact that we kind of know that now, and it's well studied, and we know that there's a long-term RO, a significant long-term ROI on innovation. How do you think about the current state of innovation policy? Are we doing the right things, and how would we, if we just kind of as a baseline know that we want to be investing in innovation and science and R&D and entrepreneurship, how do we know what the right policies are and when to toggle up or toggle down different mechanisms?
Yeah. Um, so that's actually in my personal opinion, I don't want to speak for an entire literature here, but to me at least, I think this is a very difficult question to answer. Um, One of the reasons I think that, uh, if I think about the state of the field, the state of the literature doing research on the process of innovation, I think we're now getting a lot of evidence on whether an independent policy works or doesn't work, right? So, I can tell you now what are the local effects of establishing a university on local innovation, right? There's people that have studied the effects of immigration policy on innovation. There's folks who have studied, the effect of R&D tax credits, things like that. So we sort of know policy by policy. Not always, like there's some stuff I don't think we have great evidence on, but in many cases we know our policies usually good, usually not so good. um it, it, you can know whether sort of on average a policy works or doesn't. That doesn't necessarily tell you sort of what's the right level to set that policy. And especially it's hard to know in combination, right? Policies interact with one another, and when we do these studies we're usually trying to change one policy at a time, keeping everything else constant. So I think thinking about the entire portfolio of policies and how they work together, I think is actually not something we have a really great handle on. Again, I'm speaking sort of my own read of the literature. There might be other people who've thought about this more carefully who would give you a different answer, but that's sort of how I see it. Um,
So in terms of doing research on this, you mentioned RCTs and randomized controlled trials as a way to kind of figure out, what works, what doesn't, what's happening, what's correlated, and what's really going on for something that's a portfolio wide. I don't know what you'd call it. Portfolio wide um, policy or portfolio wide intervention or design, uh, we would never be able to do research on that, right? It's like, I mean, maybe if you did a country versus country kind of thing, you'd have to do it pretty high level.
yeah, it's very
What would
hard.
the research look like if you were trying to do it at that level?
Um, I think it's difficult. I think we sort of learn kind of maybe abductively from a lot of different studies. So, I would hope as we do more and more of these RCTs or things that approximate RCTs, we sort of feel out maybe the entire landscape. And then I think the way you put these things together is this is where the role of theory and formal modeling comes in, right? Where we sort of have some idea of how stuff works, and then we have a lot of estimates of parameters from all these individual studies, and hopefully we can sort of plug these things together and back out sort of big picture numbers about what the system should look like. It's tricky because, anytime you're sort of relying on theory to tell you those kinds of answers, there's a lot of assumptions baked in, and academics are really good at arguing with each other about, are the assumptions right? Is the model exactly right? So it's, you sort of uh, maybe lose some of the internal validity that you get from these very well identified individual studies to try and get kind of a big picture answer. So
Yeah.
it's hard. I mean, I think if it was easy, we would have done it already, convincingly.
Yeah. Well, so what is the last question I want to ask you is what does the future of innovation economics and innovation policy look like?
Yeah. So I think one answer to that question is exactly what we just talked about, right? I think we'd like to get better at sort of taking these individual estimates and putting them into a bigger context and trying to think about big picture answers, right? So I'd like to know, we think we think education probably has some role to play in making people more innovative, but if I have, a dollar to spend on education, would be better to spend it on early years like K through 12, or would it be better to fund higher education, right? If I'm at the more local level, would it be better to fund a school or a library, or these kinds of questions? I think we'd like to get better at answering those, and I think we will. So that's one direction. Um, the other, I think, obvious thing, sort of the elephant in the room, is AI, right? Which we haven't really talked about today, and I'm not really an AI expert. But like, if we think the bottleneck to producing innovations comes from the fact that we're just not learning from each other and recombining ideas fast enough, well, that sounds like something AI should be really great at, right? Um, at the same time, I mean, you might think that like AI might be able to predict, the chemical composition of something that looks like it will be a great new drug. You still have to sort of take it out into the real world and run clinical trials. Like maybe the world of atoms puts a speed limit on the world of bits. So like I think getting a handle on these questions and trying to understand the role of AI, um, is obviously in the role of AI in promoting innovation is going to be obviously a really important topic. Um, one more thought, maybe. I said I'm not really an expert in AI. What's really exciting is like there are people who spend a lot of time thinking about the role of AI and innovation, and we now go to a lot of the same conferences, publish in the same journals, or reading each other's work. Uh, I think if I think about innovation as an academic community, this didn't happen by accident, but I think that there now is a community in a way that there wasn't a few decades ago, right? So if you look back at sort of the history of the field, people have recognized that innovation is important for economic growth, going all the way back to the early 1960s. So it pops up from time to time in the growth literature. There are some people in the fields of industrial organization or law and economics who maybe think about patent systems. There might be people who study specific fields like health who look at like the introduction of a particular new drug. There's actually a lot of people studying agricultural economics who looked at diffusion, but people were kind of siloed. There wasn't like a big community of people thinking about innovation as a phenomenon. And I think we're at a place now as a research community where we really do start to have a field of people who study the economics of innovation. So, a lot of the work I do is historical, but so but I can rub shoulders with people who study AI and innovation, people who study healthcare and innovation. So we can all sort of learn from each other. Um, whereas, before everybody was like feeling different parts of the elephant and trying to paint the full picture. I think now as a field ourselves, we're able to share ideas and recombine ideas much more quickly. So hopefully all these next step questions we've talked about, I'm sort of optimistic that we as a field are going to be able to address them just because there's a much more cohesive field, hopefully moving forward.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and to share your insights and wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
That would be great. It's been a pleasure, a lot of fun. Thank you.